Okay, so we can get started. My name is Nicole Morin Scribner. I'm the interviewer. Today is Friday, January 17th, 2020. We are doing this interview from the Maine State Library in one of the conference rooms that they have made available to us. And today I have the honor of interviewing, do you go by Alex or Alexander?
I go by Alex. My legal name is Alexander.
Okay, so okay if I call you Alex for
Of
this
course.
purpose, okay. And it's today I'm interviewing Alex Mouzas. Is that the way that it's pronounced?
That's pretty good, yeah.
Okay, so I usually like to start pretty much at the beginning by asking you when and where you were born.
I was born at the Weber Hospital in 1954 in Biddeford. My parents lived in Saco at the time on Lawn Avenue, near an aunt of mine who had a home on Lawn Avenue. Difficult childbirth, if we really want to go back to the beginning. The night before, there was a big snowstorm. My parents were double dating, if you will, with an uncle and his date at the Mutual Theater. And there were two movies playing, and I looked up to see what the movies were. I was curious one day. And the movies were Father's Little Dividend and Vice Squad. My mother went into labor. They got her to the hospital. Very difficult labor. In those days, things weren't technically what they are now. And my grandmother was there. Two of my aunts were there. An uncle of mine was there. My father was there. And my grandmother, who had much experience with this sort of thing, was telling the doctor that he needed to do a C-section. Doctor resisted for a long time. Next day, the story goes, and I got this from several different sources, he came out and to speak with my father. And believe it or not, but apparently it was common in those days, which we can't even fathom today, but he asked my father, if it comes down to it, who would you like me to save? Never got a straight answer, but we both made it through, and everything else has been on borrowed time since then, and that's it's been appreciated as such as we go along. Moved from Saco to Biddeford. My family were part of the owners of the Puritan that everybody knows in Biddeford. And we had an apartment above the Puritan for 3 years until 1957, until I moved back to Beach Street in Saco. The Puritan was a very interesting place for many reasons. So I'm going to, in this interview, I'm going to talk about what I know about Biddeford and my association with Biddeford rather than growing up in the Saco area.
Okay, and before we move on, so tell me about your parents, your grandparents.
Well, if we want to go back to the grandparents, my grandparents come from two very different and distinct parts of Greece. And generally speaking, a lot of the Greek American community in the Biddeford-Saco area came from these two areas. My mother's side came from the southern Peloponnese, south of Sparta, part of Sparta called Mani. Beautiful place, very rugged place. My father's side comes from the northwest part of Greece called Epirus. Interesting on how they both found the area. All my grandparents were born in the 1800s. My grandmother came over with her sister Leonie when they were both about 15 years old, 15, 16 years old, and they settled with relatives in Lowell. Her future husband was only from a village maybe 5-6 miles away. She came from Lukavica, and he came from a place called Zerova, which is now called Throsopigi, Cold Spring. As the crow flies, it's just a couple of miles away from each other, but they met and they got married in Lowell, Massachusetts. Okay, they moved here to Biddeford. Now, in those days, you have to remember, when Greeks came here, nobody else spoke Greek except Greeks. It's a difficult language, so they ended up going to where the work was and where the churches were, because the churches are where the Greeks were that could direct them as far as where to learn English, the contacts for the schools, where to get a job, where to live, and so on. My father's side was a little bit different. My grandfather was the second set of three brothers that came over. The first set came over in the teens, and they came from Papingo. Papingo is now an eco-tourist village, but it has a couple of famous sons. Michael Anagnostopoulos, anglicized to Anagnos, and he ended up being the second director of the Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Mass., Boston, Massachusetts. He did a lot of things. He set up trust funds for education and so on in Greece, in Papingo, in the Konica area. There's all kinds of statues for him over there, as well as in Watertown at the Perkins School. He's the one who was mentor to Anne Sullivan and took care of Helen Keller in her later years and was very instrumental in taking care of Helen Keller while he was director. He also did, and the reason this is related, he had a business association, and he's the one who encouraged the people in that vicinity to come to the Boston area. He was the conduit. He was the conduit and came over. I have a photograph, which I'll give you, of my my grandfather's brothers, and having a formal studio photograph taken holding Mike Anagnos' photograph, because they were that grateful for him coming over here. So they came over. The first set of older brothers came over. They had the Crown Bakery in, I believe it was Haverhill, Massachusetts. I have relatives who have found correspondence from 1915 where they wrote, we had a very busy day today. We made over $150, which in 1915 was a lot of money. They went back. The second set of brothers came over. There was an original Puritan and before in Massachusetts before the one in Biddeford. And I should note that the real name of the Puritan in Biddeford was the Puritan Tea Room and Confectionery. And I was disappointed when the building was finally sold, and I went over because there was a mosaic as you entered the door, and the mosaic was removed to make it accessible, make it a ramp so you can come in, and the mosaic has been lost. But that was where you had it in Puritan Tea Room and Confectionery. So by the time my father came over, it was a going business. He came over. My father was born in 1920. Came over in 1935. My grandfather was here with his two brothers running the Puritan. They had interesting backgrounds. People don't realize a lot of Greek Americans, the early ones, my grandfather's generation, as well as the later ones, the World War II generations, really had a lot of background as far as what went on historically in Europe. I have photographs of my grandfather in his officer uniform, a veteran of the Balkan Wars, before he came over here. Everybody looked at him as a little shopkeeper, making candy and all that type of stuff. Who knows what he had seen over there? We'll get into that a little bit later. The reason it's called the Puritan is one of the brothers, Michael Mouzas, had spent time in London, and he became an Anglophile. He loved the British lifestyle and decorum and so on. It should be noted, because of Michael Anagnos, the school system in this little village was really good. When they came over, they pretty much hit the road, running, and they opened up the restaurant, and they knew how to cook, and they were very social.
Do you know why what your ancestors were doing when they were in Greece and why they left?
Yes, I know my grandfather. Before America, a lot of people used to go to, of all places, Romania, and they did the same thing. They did a lot of trade. They opened up restaurants. They had businesses, and they came back to the Papingo area. There are books published in Greece now. We have people from Papingo in front of the pyramids. Some in China. I mean, in the mid-1800s, that's how do you do it and survive? They were quite accomplished. They were really a whole other category. Well-educated, well-traveled business people, and they heard about America. And of course, one comes over. The southern part of Greece was different. That was a tough area, and they came over here for a better life. And you have two distinct subcultures, if you will. The music's different, the food's different. The food in Epirus is actually much more complex, and I think better than in the other parts of Greece, except for perhaps Crete. My maternal grandmother actually learned how to cook the ipirotica, the northern dishes, from my grandfather. My grandfather was a very good cook, and he was very inventive. He was very well known for his dancing, as was my father. I didn't get any of that. But people used to travel for a long time just to see them dance or to dance with them at the traditional Greek dances in Epirus. Um, the music is very distinct. It's just being documented now. But that's how they came over here with people like Mike Anagnos, Mike Anagnos, and they got the word and they came over. The game plan for most Greeks that came over here, and I'm sure you've heard this from other interviews you've had, was to come over here, make the money, and go back to Greece. The lifestyle is very nice over there. The environment is very nice over there. You have different degrees of Greek immigrants doing that. You have some that came over and they never went back. You have some that came over, had kids, passed away early. The kids never had a connection and went back. Then you have some that came over, made the money, and went back and lived it up. And those are very, very few. My father was in between that. My father would take regular trips to Greece every year or every other year as I was growing up. The reason I speak Greek is when I was born, when I was a year and a half old, I was born in 54. We went to, in 55, we went to Greece and stayed there for 6 months to visit my grandparents and live with my grandparents in Papingo and also other parts of Greece. Then again, when I was 3 years old, we did the same thing. And to travel to Greece in those days, we took a steamship. The first one was the Queen Federica. Took us 10 days to go there. We stayed there for 6 months. We flew back, TWA, I have photographs. And in those days, to fly back was over 24 hours because you'd go from, first of all, you had to get to Athens from Papingo, which was a substantial trip. Maybe 10 hours by car, 12 hours. And the food was fantastic, but everybody was dressed up like you wouldn't believe. So I didn't get to speak English till I was 4 years old, and I thought it might be a good idea so I could go to school and understand what was going on. One of the reasons that a lot of my friends my age don't speak Greek to the extent that I do, not that I speak it very well, but on the scale of things, probably better than most Greek American kids my generation, was the total immersion of going back. I went back when I was 10, 15, having my grandmother at the house and all her friends. I did go to Greek school, which was in addition to regular school. I would walk to the Biddeford church from Saco Tuesdays and Thursday nights, and the Greek priest would teach us how to read and write and so on, and memorize poems, and I do mean memorize. And I've kept it up through the years. Another factor that most people forget or overlook is after World War II in the 1950s, you had a lot of patriotism in this country, and nobody's more patriotic than the Greek Americans. If you go to the Greek cemetery in Biddeford, you're going to see a very high, almost disproportional amount of veterans' flags. Everybody joined up somehow. This was their country. They wanted to be American. They assimilated very quickly when they came over. Along with that, the flip side of that was when I was growing up and people my age were growing up, not only did most people in the Biddeford Saco area not speak that much Greek because nobody spoke Greek, but nobody wanted their kid to grow up with an accent, not knowing in those days that if you learn a foreign language or languages before you're a teenager, before puberty, if you will, you don't retain the accent. So in that patriotic sense, nobody said, I don't want my kid to sound like he just got off the boat. I speak a couple of other languages, but without the total immersion, it's very difficult to keep it up.
So they leaving Greece and coming to the United States, and I heard that at least part of the family went to Lowell. I mean, the United States has all kinds of opportunities. Why the connection to Lowell? Do you know?
Yes, it was work. You had a large Greek population there. The first generation worked there, broke their backs working. Second generation usually went to school. You have the second generation that became lawyers, doctors, what have you. But Lowell had a large church. They had, I think it was either the first, I think in Biddeford we have the second Greek Orthodox cemetery in the United States. I think Lowell was the first. So it was a community where it was a landing spot, and they stuck around New England. And after I saw California for the first time, I came back and I asked my mother, I says, look, your parents came from southern Peloponnese, large oranges, beautiful water, fantastic, heavenly, absolutely heavenly. Maine, I mean, winter, this and that. I says, what's the matter with California? She says, they came over in 1903. There were no roads. A train trip was 10, 12 days if you made it over there. Nobody knew anybody out there. And I think it would have been a natural had they gone over there. Everything would have been different. But it was a matter of communication, a matter of connections. You'd get the straight scoop. And my grandmother and her sister actually used the tickets. They bought the tickets that another family sent for their two daughters to come over to the States, and the girls were afraid to go. And so my grandmother and her sister decided, we'll go. And that was a big decision because my grandmother had the very rare opportunity of being educated. In Athens, we have the family background over there. On my mother's maiden name was Karagakos. Leonidas Karagakos was a general in the late 1800s, and he had offered to sponsor my grandmother, his niece, to become educated, college educated in those days in Athens, which was a rarity. And that tradition, that part of the family, kept that part up. We just lost another relative this past year, Sarandis Karagakos, and he wrote over 100 historical books in great detail. They're on Amazon, as a matter of fact, translated into English, and so on. So it's a well-known name over there. Most of the people in Biddeford Saco are usually from either the southern Peloponnese, Mani, or from Epiros, with others, but generally speaking. And you can recognize the names easily before they were changed because the AKOS is one of the very unique suffixes on the names. My mother's maiden name was Dautakos. Dautakos, okay. Her mother's name was Karagakos. There are others in the area. I won't mention because you'll be interviewing them. Chances are, in Greece itself, I wouldn't have the lineage that I have now as far as being half from the southern part and half from the northern part, but that happens here in the U.S.
So tell me about your childhood. Now, I understood you to live some of the time in Biddeford, most of the time in Saco. Where did you go to school?
I went to school in the Saco school system. We lived on Beach Street in Saco, right at the beginning of Beach Street in Saco, 5 Beach Street, with my grandmother upstairs, number 7, starting in 1957. So Locke Grammar School was literally on the next block. It was a very nice place to grow up. I have movies of it still. My father had a movie camera given to him as a wedding gift in 1949, and he was very good with it. And there were so many more trees back then. Just on the block in front of my house from Main Street to Middle Street, there were 6 elm trees. I remember going to school there. Fairfield School, when they built that, was in the middle of the 3rd grade. We all did half a year in Locke Grammar School and half a year in Fairfield. Then Burns School was on the other block. I never had to go very far. And then Thorne Academy, I used to walk. It was not even half a mile. And I remember as a child, all the leaves in the fall, they were, when you're a kid, everything looks bigger, but all the leaves were like knee deep. Before all the elm trees got sick, and they cut them down all in 1 year, and everything changed. It was a lot of fun. I had a lot of good friends in Saco growing. It was a wonderful place to grow up. The church right across the street was beautiful, and unfortunately that's the one that burnt at the turn of the century. But I used to have friends from North Street. They used to come down on the way to school, and they used to stop at my house, and then we'd gang up and go to school together, first by foot, then by bicycles, as the years were going on. Sometimes my mother used to invite them all in for breakfast. And food was a really big thing at my house. Between my grandmother and my mother, I thought this was how it was everywhere, but we did restaurant volume at the house. All the relatives used to come over all the time and so on. But in those days, there were no cell phones. In fact, most people didn't even have phones in their homes. I remember even in the 6th grade, I got in a little fight with somebody, and they were going to send us home, and they didn't send us home because they couldn't get into the other kid's mom didn't have a phone yet. We had a what do you call it, party line at our house upstairs and downstairs, but it was no big deal. We didn't have the problems we have now. Everybody used to run everywhere. All of us looked like coyotes. We had no fat on us because we'd run around all day outside, and on the way back, if you rode your J.C. Penney 1-speed, which weighed more than half of what we did, in those days, everybody had a dog that wasn't on a leash. So you'd go by somebody's yard, and sure enough, the dog would start to chase you. So you'd have to sprint and get away from the dog, and then on trash night, you'd have to watch out and keep the neighbors' dogs out of your trash and so on. There was a lot more close to nature. We used to do a lot of things. There was a lot of fishing. My father used to take me fishing in a lot of places in Biddeford and Saco, all of which are developed now or are inaccessible. There used to be a lot more birds and a lot more wildlife. I remember swarms of blackbirds. I remember farmers out in going towards Dayton used to invite us to go out there to try out shotguns to kill the blackbirds so they wouldn't go after the crops and stuff. And there were like thousands and thousands and thousands of them. You don't see that here anymore. The population was so much less then. It was a whole different thing. So growing up in Saco was like that. However, I used to go back and forth to Biddeford because my father was working at the Puritan, and go to Greek school. He used to walk there. He used to walk back. It was no big deal. It was like a mile. Everybody used to walk everywhere back then. In fact, when I was first born, living on Lawn Avenue, my grandmother used to walk from Emery Street, Biddeford, all the way to Lawn Avenue to come visit my mother and see how she was doing and with me and so on. Everybody in those days in Biddeford and Saco had a garden. Everybody used to bring things to the house. I remember these huge carrots. Of course, when you're a kid, everything looks bigger, but these were organic carrots. They were big. Everybody used to bring something they used to cook. My grandmother had, whenever there was a funeral, an engagement, a wedding, her friends all used to come over and make the spinach pies, the spanakopita, so the different types of pies. And they used to make them by hand with the little dowels. They were very, very good at doing the fuel, and now you buy it. Back then it was all hand done. And all these ladies were, if they were over 5 feet tall, they were giants. They were all about 5 feet tall, but they were very competitive. And in a friendly way, they'd say, "You don't know what you're doing. I'm doing it this way. Why do you do it that way?" And it was all delicious. Don't get me wrong. Everything was wonderful. But they all had fantastic memories. Now, you have to remember, a lot of them weren't literate. But if somebody called up, they would remember not only the name, but the telephone number. They knew who. They may not have seen their friends for 10, 20 years, but they had. They knew what the kids were doing, what the grandkids were doing, where they were, who they married, and so on. Fantastic memories. Fantastic memories. Many of them had very large families. My grandmother had 12 pregnancies, 2 miscarriages, 10 children, 8 of whom became adults. And we used to have dandelions back then. At first, when growing up, I felt a little embarrassed that we used to have dandelions at the house. Now it's a superfood. But back then, it was like all the old ladies used to go out picking dandelions.
So, with regards to when you were in school, what was the makeup of the school, of the student body? Your neighbors, the other kids that you were hanging around with. Were you the only one who was Greek American?
No, I wasn't. There were other Greek American kids. This is Saco we're talking about now.
Right.
Okay. There were quite a few in my generation. But everybody wanted to be American. We didn't play it up all that much, except after school we'd have to run to Greek school or we'd have to go to church for 2 hours. And in those days, the church in Biddeford. Now at this time, it was on Adams Street. It wasn't on Emery Street anymore. And I was an altar boy for 6 years, from age 8 till 14. Church was every week. Had to dress up, very uncomfortable clothes. When I was really young, they were still in the old days. Everybody stood up. There were no pews, just like they do in the old churches in Greece, in the villages. Everybody stands. And the men were on the right-hand side, and the women were on the left-hand side with the kids. Very, very long weddings, 2-3 hour weddings, the service. Very long funerals, 2-3 hour funeral services, not like they do it now. Everything was in Greek. Nobody understood anything because it was the proper biblical Greek, or, two worlds. I lived in the world with my friends during school and so on. But I used to go back oftentimes to the Puritan, which is what we're relating to now. And the Puritan had a really interesting mix of people. There's one group that not too many people remember. I remember them because I used to see them a lot when I was younger. A lot of people after World War II escaped Europe. Specifically after World War II, you had the boundaries of Greece had changed so that Albania was expanded, and a lot of Greeks were caught behind that. They call them Vodi Epirotes, Northern Greeks. They're actually Greek, but they were in Albania, behind the communist wall. But before that, you had a lot of Albanians escape Albania, and they ended up, like the Greeks, they ended up here in Biddeford. They spoke some Greek, this and that. Everybody had a nickname. Nobody knew their real name because they didn't want to be found. There are a lot of stories, and I'll give you some of the names later, of people who were here in the U.S. and they would be getting letters from the communist Albanian government, come back, or we're going to kill your brother, or we're going to, he's already in prison, blah, blah, blah. And they wouldn't go back. It was a very difficult decision, but they wouldn't go back because they'd be in prison too. There's one gentleman in Portland that was in prison for 40 years. He finally made it out, and his wife waited for him all that time. But they all had nicknames. I remember nicknames like Black Cat, Kinam, Jello, Kitsulina, and there was one guy, very nice, and they were all very nice. They were always dressed in a suit. They might have one suit, but they wore it all the time. Tie, suit, everybody dressed up in those days. And there was one gentleman named Hoja, very nice man. They all gambled. They all gambled on the horses or card games at the Greek coffee house and this and that, which saw a lot of action, by the way. And it didn't occur to me until I started college and started some history courses. It turns out he was the uncle of the Hoja, who was the communist leader of Albania. He's buried at 5 Points in Biddeford. If you go into the cemetery at 5 Points, what's the name of the cemetery there? Woodlawn Cemetery. As you go in from the Burger King side on West Street there, on the left-hand side, you're going to see markers, and they're all Muslim markers. That's that group of Muslim Albanians that used to hang around the Puritan. And no one's ever done any kind of study or background on them, but a lot of them were bachelors. A lot of them were worth a lot of money because they used to work like crazy, but they used to gamble also, and some of them were pretty good at it. The house was an interesting place.
So tell me, what is the Greek coffee house?
It no longer exists. It turns out my grandfather, my mother's father, who died in 1945, when he first came over, worked at the mills for a very short time and opened up a coffee house. He passed away. Someone else opened up another one. And what would happen is the old men would go in there, not the old men, all the men used to go in there, and the games, different card games, Barbut, which is another not well-known game here, poker, all these games were played there for big money, even by today's standards. 1963, $7,000 pots, $100,000 pots. It started getting broken up when people from out of state used to come in and raid the games from Rhode Island. Then the police started noticing and so on. That's a whole other interview. But you'd be surprised some of the things that went on in Biddeford. It's incredible.
Where were those? Was that downtown?
All right, as you go from the Puritan down towards the river, on the right-hand side, there's a building there. It's an apartment building now. And one block below it was where Anassasov's photograph studio used to be. And from what I understand, Anastasov's used to be up towards City Hall where Days used to be now on that corner there. Two of my mother's sisters, my Aunt Tony and my Aunt Stella, were very pretty when they were younger. And Anastasov had life-size, larger than life-size photographs made of them, and they were part of his advertising. Because in those days, you only had like one formal photograph. It's not like now where everybody takes selfies every 5 minutes. It's 5 seconds, I should say. Back then, when you were a teenager or you looked, you've come of age, you had a nice photograph taken. But downtown Biddeford was a lot of fun. We used to go, my mother used to take me out. I had to be dressed up. We'd go to Fishman's. Fishman's had everything. I can still remember the place. I remember when it closed. Butler's across the street, I remember, because it had some kind of a vacuum system for the bills where if you bought something, you would have to go up to accounting. And as a kid, it was fascinating to me. It looked like Futurama. It was like, going through the tube and going back. I was mesmerized. Woolworth's across the street, to me, I loved it because it was like a nature center. They used to sell parakeets and canaries, and you used to go in there and you'd be surrounded by that, and you'd have the aquariums in front of you. It was like going to the zoo. And we'd go back and get a haircut across the street at Mac's. Palakwich, I still have clothes hangers and a coat from Palakwich from when I was a teenager. And it was a vibrant downtown. You had the mills, big football town, and it was scary because when I used to visit my father when I was in the 7th grade, in the 8th grade, and I used to play football, and I used to do okay. And people in Biddeford were watching me play football in Saco, seeing who Thornton was going to have coming up. I mean, it was like a full-time hobby for some folks. Big rivalry, but the Puritan was great. They had the jukeboxes in each booth. They had the tiles on the floor. I have some photographs that you can post. I still have one of the Hamilton mixes, the Art Deco style one. The prices I remember ice cream cones, double scoop, 15 cents. Hamburgers were 10 cents, 15 cents. Everything was 1/10 of what it is now. They had a cigar, nice cigar, El Productos, some others I remember. Everybody used to smoke back then. I don't smoke. I was allergic to it. But everybody, because it was in the movies. Everybody in the movies smoked. Everybody promoted it. It was a terrible habit, but that's what everybody did back then. People used to dance in the Puritan from time to time. The music would play. Once in a while, you'd see people dancing. I remember when I was younger, one of the waitresses used to teach me how to cha-cha when I was like 4 years old. It was a lot of fun. It was just a lot of fun. Across the street from the Puritan, where Grady's is now, where his parking lot is now, there used to be that was Cohen's corner store. Twinkies, I remember, 15 cents. We used to go over there, say hi to Mr. Cohen. Further down the hill, there was a coffee bean store named, and its name was Pericles Economos.
So, sticking with the Puritan,
Yes.
Did you ever work there? Did your family spend some time there? I'm guessing, of course.
My father.
Yeah. So, how many hours did he?
Oh.
How much time did he spend there?
All day, all night, split shift. My mother waitress there a little bit. My parents met because when my grandfather was there, when my father first came over, he went to Biddeford High School to learn English and get assimilated into the culture. He was told to go to high school. He had a good education from Yanina, Greece, but doesn't count when you come over. And he met one of the people who would help him was my mother's brother, my Uncle Nick, who later got a job at the Puritan. Okay, so they would both work at the Puritan, and that's how he met my mother, and that's how they hit it off, got engaged, and eventually married. Yeah, my father was working all the time. I always remember him with the apron. He'd go to, what people don't realize about my father is, although he was when he was here, he was behind the counter at the Puritan. When he'd go to Greece, he would go boar hunting. He'd travel all over the place. He'd go wild goat hunting. He was a hit of the party when it came to dancing. All the musicians know him. There's a famous musician now in Greece. He's in his 80s now. His name is Petrouloukas Halkias. Even he remembered my father. I showed him a picture at the concert he gave in Watertown last year. And he remembered him and stuff. But he was very well known, and so was my grandfather. So it was like, Walter Mitty, mild-mannered restaurant owner over here, and in Greece, he's on mountaintops looking down 2,000 feet. There's a story that's related to Biddeford concerning Popingo. Two of them, actually, three of them. First of all, the Puritan, in 1952, my grandfather and his brothers donated $10,000 to make the road to Popingo a permanent road. Okay, $10,000 in 1952 was substantial. You could buy a couple of houses. And it became a permanent road. If you go up the road now, which has 21 switchbacks, 21 hairpin turns, you'll see a statue of Michael Mouzas, a bust overlooking the road there. They also gave Milton Mouzas, his brother, gave a lot of money for a church in Popingo. You'll see his name on a bell tower there as well too. One of the things that the old timers used to do is send seeds back and forth, flowers, fruits, vegetables. Okay, we don't think of it these days because we just go and get them. But in those days, if you go to Beach Street, Saco, my old house, there's still a grapevine growing back there. My grandmother brought that from southern Greece in 1967 when she took a trip over there, and she brought it back. And who thought grapes would grow in Beach Street, Saco with all kinds of shade in it? But they're still there. One of the things they used to do is my grandfather and his brothers used to go to Pickard's farm store on Lower Main Street in Biddeford, and they'd send seeds back and forth. Well, Greece is a type of place, if you throw a seed in the ground, come back in a week and you're going to see, all these plants. It's very, very fertile over there. Koinica is a place that never really had cantaloupes as an indigenous species in Greece. But one of the major products out of Koinica now is cantaloupes. It came from Pickard's feed store, from what we can tell. And I heard the stories 3-4 different ways. Oh, yeah, your grandfather sent these old, going back decades and stuff. But that was a big thing back then, is to, I can't get the food the way it is in Greece. Can you send me some seeds? I want to grow it here in the garden. That was a big deal. That was a big deal, and we've lost track of that. All the old timers used to spend a lot more time outdoors. I remember going to Biddeford Pool with my grandmother and my aunts to collect mussels, okay, or with my grandmother for dandelions. Or my father and my uncle used to go rabbit hunting, or for pheasant, okay. Hunting was part of the deal, and but Biddeford Saco was more rural in those days. You can't do that now. You can't do that now.
So did you ever work at the Puritan yourself?
No. I started working. My father, when he left the Puritan in the 60s, opened up a restaurant with a couple of partners called the Roundup in Old Orchard Beach, and he had it for a couple of years, and I was a busboy there. When you work in a Greek family, you cannot quit, you cannot get fired. You're there. And you're there all the time so they can keep an eye on you, and you get to know how everything works. So, if you have to fill in, you fill in. First day off I had in the summertime, well, I was 38 years old. After my father eventually opened up a gift store in the Whitehall building, which my aunt owned in Old Orchard Beach, and he had a gift store there, and it was from 8:30 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. 7 days a week from Memorial Day till after Labor Day. So even if I were working, I had some good jobs in Newport, Rhode Island and other places, I would come back on my days off and help them out so they wouldn't be there all days. And they finally retired, and I finally got a day off when I was 38 years old.
Now, I know that so at the Puritan, what was their, I know you said there was a lot of different people that went there, but what was their primary clientele? Was it breakfast, lunch?
Usually, it varied. You had the lunch breaks from the factories. You had professionals in the area. I remember Tuffy Fitzhenry's had his lawyer's office upstairs. You had a lot of lawyers come in, you had people from the factories come in, and then you had the high school kids come in after school. And they'd order one Coke for a nickel, and they'd be there for 3 hours. And everybody I've met as an adult used to tell me, "Oh, your grandfather kicked me out of the Puritan. He was a nice guy, you know." In a nice way. Everybody either met their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their husband, their wife. Everybody went through the Puritan from Biddeford area. Some people went to Biddeford High School. Some people went to St. Louis High School. By the way, I played in the last Thornton St. Louis football game. I want you to know. St. Louis won that one 7-0. The World War II generation had a whole different atmosphere, and there was more commonality, I think, among the people. People would, if you were broken down the road, people would stop. It's not like today. It was a whole different feeling. We did have dances. In those days, all the high schools had dances on the weekends. And you'd go from, if Thornton Academy didn't have one, you'd go to the Biddeford one or St. Joe's or St. John's or what have you, and you'd see where most of the people were at the time. It was a lot of fun. The demographics were such that, there were plenty of people to meet, and people actually used to dress up to do things. You used to try to look nice. I remember that part.
Well, you mentioned something that I wanted to ask, which is, what were some traditions that you had in your family, surrounding holidays or even just weekends?
A lot of food. In a Greek American household, not so much here as much, but there are certain saint days, like St. Patrick's Day. Okay, well, look, there's a bunch of saints. If you go to any Greek church, they usually have a calendar that names all these days, and you'll find there's at least 2 or 3 every week. If your name is Alex, there's actually, my name day is August 30th, for example, St. Alexander. There's actually, there's St. Alexander. My father actually had 2 name days, one in January, one in May. His real name was Athanasius. He anglicized it to Arthur, okay, because in those days you changed your name. So whenever there was an excuse, the cooking began. I can't overemphasize how much food there was. After my grandmother passed away, of course it went down a few notches because her whole generation started to go. And when that generation of ladies from the old country started to go, that's things changed a lot.
Now, where is the Greek cemetery?
10 Cole Road. I was on in Biddeford. I was on the managing committee of the cemetery for several years, one project that I really wanted everybody to do was you could go into that cemetery and plot by plot, every one of those is almost a unique story. There's some similarities, but you have a lot of interesting people there. You have a lot of interesting people in that cemetery. You have some people who came over that were veterans of the Balkan Wars as well as World War I. Ted Gregorakis, and then there's others. You have all kinds of interesting stories there. A lot of people, a lot of the men from the area were merchant marines, made the money, came back, invested in businesses. The ladies, if you saw the parts of Greece that, especially the people from the southern part of Greece came from, you go over there, and some of these places look like moonscape. They're really, really tough. It's beautiful, but it's really, really tough. And you say, wow, how did they come from here? And there's one particular section where if you go down to Old Orchard Beach in Biddeford, you're going to say, oh, that family has all these business. That family has all these business. They came from nothing. And they came over and they learned like that, and they got into it, and they did it well, and they became successful.
Now, you mentioned that assimilation was really important, but other than the church, did those of Greek origin within the Biddeford-Saco area make it a point to be connected to the others?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the immigrants of that era, and I have photographs that prove it, my father came over in 1935. He was 15 years old. Okay, I have a picture of him and one of his best friends. Their biggest goal, teenage guys, was to dress and look better than Frank Sinatra. All that generation liked to look sharp. And that's why a lot of my friends don't speak Greek or never learned Greek, because they wanted to be American. They wanted to be American. They were very, very sociable, always invited people to events. Back in the 30s and 40s, I mean, these were the days during the Depression where my mother and her brother and her sisters used to pick blueberries and sell them door to door when they were kids. Okay? But even then, my grandfather in those days always used to invite somebody for either Christmas or Thanksgiving or something, not necessarily Greek, just somebody who was on their own. And of course, they used to try to get be as social as possible. But you have to also understand, in those days, and a lot of people today won't understand it, but in those days, a lot of Greeks met some discrimination as well. Let's talk about it a little bit. You had, for whatever reasons, Maine, you say to yourself, well, Maine's pretty homogeneous. No, it isn't. They'd some of the banking policies tried to work against them, and the cure for that was to make so much money that it didn't matter. Okay, I don't need your loan, thank you. And then Purple Bank helped out a lot because they actually knew the people there. But you had a lot of that. I won't get into it too much on this interview, but there are quite a few instances where even I noticed it. Everything was fine because if you look at me, most people don't think I'm Greek. Greeks don't think I'm Greek, and yet when they hear the last name, all of a sudden, things changed. And I never believed it until I was, close to 30. And then looking back, I said, okay, that makes sense now. But thankfully, a lot of that has been regulated out. Everybody talks about regulations, but there's a reason for them. Keeps people from getting hurt a lot of times.
Now, I know that with the Franco-Americans, they had a lot of associations and groups and clubs that were pretty homogenous to that background. Was there, again, other than the church, which I assume...
Yeah, there were two clubs. One of them, there were several church groups, both for men and for ladies. I just stepped down as vice president for the Lacones, which is a philanthropic group of people from Laconia, if you will, southern part of Greece. And that was formed to provide funerary services, burial amounts for immigrants that couldn't afford to bury themselves, get buried by the family when they first came over. And so we provide a death benefit if you're in the club. The only provision is you have to be from Laconia, the southern part of Greece. And that's been going on for a long time. The Greek cemetery started in 1915. And the Lacones has been along, and we've built up the kitty so that they can self-insure themselves now. And then now they're starting to provide some other benefits too that are culturally related, so people can actually go to Greece and see where their grandparents came from and so on. The AHEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, didn't start in Maine. They had a chapter in Maine that just closed. But that was formed almost in a direct response to the KKK. People don't realize what a strong KKK there was in Maine before my generation. There were, and you can find this at the library. There were parades in Biddeford and Saco, usually coming from Saco to Biddeford, and all dressed up and all that sort of thing. I saw some instances of it as I was growing up. Not just word of mouth or direct contact, but I remember they were in Sauk. Somebody was restoring a house, and they found the paraphernalia. They found the capes and the hood and all that stuff. And surprisingly, they thought they were doing something historic when they actually displayed them outside the house in a little cabinet there, and that got taken down in fairly short order. But the immigrants went through a lot. They went through a lot. A lot of it was, I hate to talk about something ugly, but let's call it the invisible hood. There was a lot of that.
Did your parents become American citizens?
Well, my mother was born here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. My mother was born here. My father became an American citizen right away. My grandfather became an American citizen when he came over. That was job one. You don't understand. They were very patriotic, very enthusiastic about this country.
So when did your father get out of the Puritan business?
He got out of the Puritan in 1964, I believe, and one of the other cousins had it for a while, and then the cousin who owned the building, who lives in Connecticut, sold the building, and it eventually got sold to, I believe, the people who have it now. That became the Happy Dragon. Yeah. And one thing about the Puritan that I remember as a kid, which fascinated me, is the office was down cellar. And you go down cellar, and it was medieval. It was like one of the old cellars and stuff, and all the refrigeration compression units, the air conditioning were downstairs, and it looked like a mad scientist lair. But there were, in those days, we used to have the Coca-Cola trays that are all antiques now, hundreds of them. And my father and my grandfather used to give them out a lot because kids used to go sliding on Pike Street with them down that big hill. They used to use them as sleds. Now, people put them on the wall or collect them.
Now, were there any legends or rumors about the Puritan that that you've heard, or that maybe reality was a little bit different?
No, I think it was the original Al's Place on Happy Days. All the everybody from when the factories were there, and it's when the factories left that the Puritan went down. But when the factories were there, especially, it was it looked like ants going in there. It was busy all the time. You had a lot of people that I remember seeing people who were traveling through Biddeford, traveling salesmen or this and that also used to stop in the Puritan too.
Mm. So, in terms of your personal journey, how did you then? What did you do after you got out of school? Did you decide to go to? I think you went to college.
I did. I went to the University of Maine at Orono. In high school, I really enjoyed high school. I was on a winning track team. I really enjoyed running. I went to Orono, and I wanted to major in art and archaeology. And I had an uncle who worked for the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Commerce, but he worked in Eastern Bloc countries at the time, behind the Iron Curtain. Yeah. And he told me that I should change my major, and I did. And I ended up getting a degree in international affairs and economics.
I can only imagine the conversations based on the hard work, concrete, run a restaurant, and saying I'm going to go to college to study art and archaeology.
They understood the archaeology part because they used to take me to all the museums in Greece. When we used to travel up to Papingo, even when I was 10 years old or 15 years old, it was a long ride. Sometimes it was a 2-day trip. So you'd go from Athens, you go to Delphi, you go see the museum at Delphi and all that. From Delphi, you go to Meteora, where you have the monasteries, and you get a whole different thing over there. Yanina, you have all the history of Yanina and all that stuff. Then you go to the Doni, the oldest oracle in Greece was outside of Ionia. It's just getting famous now, even though, then we'd go down to Sparta. We'd stop at Olympia. So I had, at least I saw some of the things that I could relate to. And I said, okay, and they're still finding this stuff. This sounds pretty exciting. I really wanted to get into that environment.
And did you stay in Maine after you graduated from college?
No. I got out, and I ended up being a real estate consultant for these resort properties that had problems, all these timeshare resorts and so on. I would be the cleanup guy. I'd go in there. I'd have to talk to the attorney general, talk to the banks, and all this and that, and get them back on track. And I did that throughout the U.S., from Texas, Missouri, Newport, Rhode Island. I stayed for 4 years in Newport, Cape Cod. I did it for a year in London, and also in Greece. A lot of different universes. Met a lot of nice people. In a lot of different environments. So then I came back, did my own real estate for a while. Was with then I ended up working for Pan Am, for Guilford Transportation, and I really enjoyed that. I was the sales and marketing director for Pan Am, third generation of Pan Am. It wasn't the big one that stopped with Lockerbie, the second one that the that Carnival had. But I had access to everything Pan Am, all the archives, all the pieces from the old days, you know. And I could think of when I was a kid flying TWA, and I have a Pan Am bag and all that. And it was absolutely marvelous. And I looked up, and it turns out right now the Boston and Maine actually owns the Pan Am logo when I was there. Previously, Pan Am had owned Boston and Maine. And the person that at one point, way back, that held the same position that I had, and was probably an honorary position, was Amelia Earhart.
So how has your experience in Biddeford compared to some of the other places that you've been?
Well, Biddeford I've seen change a lot. You know, Biddeford has always been a place for me, seeing my father's earliest business, and the basics were there. This is where the church was, this is where the Greek school was, this is where we lived for a short time, this is where my father got his start, okay? So all things stem from there. Interesting to see how other people have done really, really well coming out of Biddeford, and also made a lot of nice friends from Biddeford. You know, not just Saco, although I grew up in Saco. There's a commonality. There are still enough people of my age that I can see that we grew up together, so we still have a commonality of background. No matter where you've been or what, and everybody's been everywhere, and you know, military here, there, and so on, and done a lot of things. But we all started, you know, we all have the same baseline, if you will. So yeah, no, it's great. A lot of changes for the better, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the things I often ask people as well is asking them for, you know, recollections of impact it had on you on different things that happened historically. Like, for example, did the Vietnam War, were you affected by the draft, or?
I still have my draft card. I went to Thornton Academy, and everybody's older brother got drafted. I remember at Thornton Academy walking from class to class, and you could hear Marymount, they would test the M60 machine gun, so you go from class to class, and you hear ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, you know, on the way over. And it probably affected my attitude because, like, you know, the media in those days, you know, was against the war and all this and that, and everybody thought they were going to go. I didn't have to go because I went to college, and while I was in college, they did away with the draft. But I still have my draft card, and my number was number 36, so I would have gotten on the first round if the draft were in place, because they picked 0 to 50. But I didn't have to go to Vietnam. I had friends who went there. I have a cousin who died there, Denny Vatistis. I have friends of who have had brothers who have passed away from the after effects as well. The Agent Orange and so on.
Now, another major event that happened, you know, during that time span is the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. I remember the John F. Kennedy. They sent us home from school. I also remember ducking under the desk for a nuclear war preparation. Get under your desk. I remember the day John F. Kennedy was overcast, slightly overcast that day, and they sent us home. Of course, I didn't have far to go. I was, you know, right next door.
So, what has being from Biddeford meant to you? How has it impacted you?
Oh, well, you've got to understand, it's not. I look back at what my relatives did and take inspiration from them. Biddeford is what you make it. Right now, I think it's. I'm so glad to see University of New England Medical School there. I see the redevelopment happening. I use the Eastern Trail all the time. I live in a nice part of Biddeford. You know, the river's there. There's a good direction that it's going.
Now, what is something that you'd want to make sure that people take away from hearing your story?
I would say enjoy your environment. I'll give you the same advice that my grandmother once gave me, because I thought you wanted to be traditional and all this and that. No, everybody should go where they're happiest. Don't worry about roots. You know, roots. The people around you is where your home is, whether it's friends or relatives, what have you. And if Biddeford makes you happy, stay in Biddeford. If you find some other place you like better, don't feel bad about it. Just, life is short.
And I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that maybe hasn't come out because I didn't ask the question? I know you did a lot of preparation.
Yeah, and I didn't. No, there's a lot of. There are a lot of stories in Biddeford. There's a lot of. There's a lot of undocumented history. So I'm glad you're doing this. And I have a list of people who are actually older than I am, that are in better shape than I am, that could probably give you the generation before me their perspective and a much better first-hand knowledge. I'm glad you're doing this because it makes a difference when you talk to people who actually lived it.
Okay.
Thank you.